Westland Dairy was a familiar name. It stood as a significant player in the regional dairy industry. Its products reached many homes. The dairy processed vast quantities of raw milk every single day. This milk arrived from numerous farms near and far. The operation was complex. It involved many stages. Collection, pasteurization, homogenization, and packaging were all part of the daily rhythm. The plant was a hive of activity, a place of constant motion. Its success was built on efficiency and output, a model many admired from afar, yet few understood intimately from within its bustling walls. The journey of milk through Westland Dairy was a carefully orchestrated ballet of logistics and machinery. Tankers would arrive, their silver flanks gleaming under the yard lights or the pale morning sun. They would connect to intake pipes. Powerful pumps would then draw the cool liquid into a network of stainless steel. From there, it flowed through heat exchangers, separators, and fillers. Each step was designed to transform the raw agricultural product into something safe, stable, and marketable. The sheer volume was immense. It was a testament to modern food processing capabilities, a marvel of engineering designed for relentless production. Inside the main processing building, the environment was a symphony of industrial sounds. The hum of electric motors provided a constant bass note. The hiss of steam and the clatter of bottling lines added layers to the soundscape. There were specific smells too. The sweet, sometimes slightly sour aroma of milk was pervasive. Cleaning agents added a sharper chemical tang to the air at regular intervals. Workers moved with purpose, their roles defined by the needs of the machines and the flow of the product. They were cogs in a large, intricate system, each performing tasks that contributed to the final output that lined supermarket shelves. Westland Dairy was not content to merely maintain its position. There was an unspoken yet palpable pressure for growth. New contracts were sought. Production targets often inched higher. This ambition was understandable in a competitive market. However, this drive for increased output began to stretch the existing systems. The infrastructure, the workforce, and perhaps even the established safety protocols were being tested. Small cracks, almost invisible at first, began to appear in the daily operations. A persistent issue within certain areas of Westland Dairy was the dust. It was not the ordinary dust of a neglected corner. This was specific to their operations. In the bagging plant, fine milk powder hung in the air, a constant, almost invisible mist. It settled on machinery, on ledges, and on the workers themselves. In other areas, dust from animal feed components stored or processed nearby could also become airborne. It was a byproduct of the very materials they handled daily. This particulate matter became a feature of the working environment, something many had learned to expect, if not entirely accept, as part of the job. The existing dust extraction systems were, to put it mildly, inadequate. Some were old, others seemed poorly maintained or simply not designed for the volume of particulate matter being generated, especially as production quotas might have subtly increased over time. The consequence was clear. The dust was not effectively captured at its source. Instead, it dispersed, creating a hazy atmosphere in certain sections of the plant. Workers would find a fine film on their clothes and skin by the end of their shifts. The air itself felt thick at times, a tangible reminder of the microscopic particles they were inhaling with every breath taken during their long hours. When it came to personal protective equipment, or PPE, there was a disconnect. Basic disposable masks were sometimes available. However, these were often not of the correct type or grade to protect against fine particulate matter like milk powder. Workers reported that these flimsy masks would quickly become clogged. They made breathing difficult without offering substantial protection. The requests for better quality, more suitable respiratory protection seemed to fall on deaf ears or get lost in bureaucratic channels. It was a small item, a simple mask, yet its absence or inadequacy spoke volumes about the prevailing attitude towards subtle, chronic workplace hazards. This constant exposure to dust and the lack of effective protection led to a dangerous normalization of the hazard. For some, it was just part of the job. New workers might initially be concerned, but seeing more experienced colleagues working without adequate masks or with ineffective ones, they too might adapt. The human body is resilient, but it also has its limits. The long-term effects of inhaling fine particulate matter were not immediately obvious. They were insidious, creeping up over time. This acceptance of a visible, tangible risk was a crucial element in the unfolding safety crisis, a silent agreement to tolerate the intolerable. Worker B was employed in the milk powder bagging plant. This was an area particularly prone to high concentrations of airborne milk powder. Their daily tasks involved operating and monitoring the machinery that filled large sacks with the fine, dusty product. It was a repetitive job requiring attention to detail to ensure correct weights and proper sealing of the bags. For hours on end, Worker B was enveloped in the powdery environment. The fine particles were an unavoidable part of their immediate workspace. They saw it, they felt it, and unknowingly they breathed it in, shift after shift. Over a period of several months, Worker B began to experience health problems. It started subtly. A persistent dry cough was the first sign. Then came a tightness in the chest. Breathing, especially during exertion or at night, became more difficult. These were not the symptoms of a common cold. They lingered. They worsened. Worker B, connecting their deteriorating respiratory health to their work environment, grew increasingly concerned. The connection seemed undeniable. The timing of the onset of symptoms coincided with their prolonged exposure in the bagging plant, a place where the air itself felt heavy with powder. Recognizing the potential link, Worker B took action. They made several requests to their line supervisor for better quality dust masks. They explained their symptoms. They pointed out the inadequacy of the standard issue paper masks, which offered little real protection against the fine milk powder. These requests were not casual remarks. They were earnest pleas for a safer working environment, for a basic tool to protect their health. Worker B believed that a simple upgrade in PPE could make a significant difference to their well-being and ability to perform their duties without further harm to their lungs. Unfortunately, Worker B's request did not result in the provision of suitable respiratory protection. The responses they received were often dismissive. Sometimes it was a vague promise to look into it. Other times it was an implication that they were being overly sensitive, or that the current masks were sufficient. The issue of cost for better masks might have been an unstated factor. Worker B felt unheard and undervalued. Their legitimate health concerns directly linked to their work were seemingly brushed aside. This failure to respond to a clear signal of distress was a critical misstep, a missed opportunity to address a growing problem before it escalated further. The forecourt at Westland Dairy was more than just a paved area. It was a dynamic, bustling hub of activity, a critical junction point where internal operations met the external world of logistics and transport. This open space served multiple purposes simultaneously. It was where raw milk tankers arrived for unloading. It was where finished products were loaded onto different trucks for distribution. Employees also used it to move between buildings. Forklift trucks, company vans, and pedestrian workers all shared this relatively compact area. It was a place of constant movement, a complex dance of vehicles and people. Westland Dairy's own operational needs significantly shaped the forecourt's usage. The intake bays for milk tankers were a primary focus. Hoses snaked across the ground during unloading. Workers, often referred to as operatives or yard staff, were tasked with guiding these tankers, connecting the equipment and overseeing the transfer of milk simultaneously. Other parts of the forecourt might be used for dispatch. Pallets of finished dairy products, cartons of milk, tubs of butter, bags of powder would be marshalled, ready for collection. This internal traffic, essential to Westland's core business, created a baseline level of congestion and interaction. Adding to this complexity was Southern Freight. They were a key logistics partner, responsible for transporting a significant volume of milk to and from the dairy. Their large articulated tankers were a common sight on the forecourt. Southern Freight drivers, while familiar with the general layout, were external contractors. Their schedules were tight. Their primary focus was on the efficient collection or delivery of their load. This introduced another layer of movement and another set of priorities into the already busy space. The coordination between Westland staff and Southern Freight drivers was crucial, yet often informal. The result was an environment characterized by continuous motion and a high potential for interaction between heavy vehicles and pedestrians. The choreography of this movement was not always precise. Assumptions were made, sight lines could be obstructed. The sheer number of daily vehicle movements, tankers arriving, tankers departing, forklifts zipping back and forth, smaller delivery vans created a complex web of paths. In such an environment, clear rules, well-maintained infrastructure and constant vigilance were paramount. Any breakdown in these elements could easily lead to confusion, close calls or worse, as the demands on this shared space intensified. Section 5. Fading lines. Growing dangers. Neglect takes hold. The physical condition of the Westland Dairy forecourt was a visible sign of underlying issues. Over time, the surface had deteriorated. Potholes had formed in several areas, creating uneven patches that could jolt vehicles and present trip hazards for pedestrians. Some of these depressions would collect water after rain, obscuring their depth and creating further risks. The general state of the tarmac was worn. It was clear that routine maintenance and repair of this critical operational area had not been a top priority. These physical flaws were not just cosmetic, they had practical implications for safety and efficiency. Compounding the problem of the uneven surface was the state of the road markings. Painted lines intended to demarcate pedestrian walkways, vehicle routes and no-go zones had become faded, and in some places almost entirely obliterated. This lack of clear guidance created ambiguity. Drivers might not be certain of the preferred path for their large vehicles. Pedestrians, including Westland's own employees like Worker C, lacked clearly defined safe routes to navigate the busy yard. This ambiguity increased the risk of vehicles and people inadvertently coming into conflict, especially during busy periods or in poor visibility conditions. One of Westland's supervisors had taken notice of these deteriorating conditions. More than just the physical state, they were also concerned about the company's health and safety policies. These policies, documented in manuals, seemed outdated. They did not appear to adequately address the current scale of operations or the specific hazards present in the forecourt. The supervisor had voiced these concerns, pointing out that the written procedures were not always reflected in daily practice. There was a growing gap between the official stance on safety and the reality on the ground. A disconnect that worried those with direct oversight of day-to-day work. These seemingly small neglects, the potholes, the faded lines, the outdated policies, were more than minor inconveniences. They were symptoms of a broader cultural issue. They contributed to an environment where risks were subtly normalized. When visible standards of maintenance and safety are allowed to slip, it can send an implicit message that these things are not truly important. This erosion of standards, piece by piece, can create a fertile ground for accidents. Each faded line, each unrepaired pothole was a small crack in the dairy's safety armor, making the system progressively more vulnerable to the pressures it faced. Section 6. The deluge of deliveries. Pressure mounts on a strained system. A significant shift occurred at Westland Dairy. A strategic business decision was made to increase the volume of milk processed. This decision was likely driven by positive market conditions, new contracts, or an ambition to capture a larger market share. From a purely commercial perspective, it made sense. Growth often equates to success and increased profitability. However, this decision to ramp up intake had direct and immediate consequences for the daily operations on the ground, particularly concerning the already bustling forecourt and the logistics of milk collection and delivery, putting a strain on every part of the process. The most immediate impact of this decision was a surge in milk tanker traffic. More milk meant more tankers arriving at the dairy's gates each day. These were not just Westland's own vehicles or those of regular contractors like Southern Freight. To cope with the increased demand, Westland began to rely more heavily on agency tanker drivers. These drivers were often less familiar with the specific layout, procedures and potential hazards of the Westland dairy site. They might be working for different haulage companies, brought in on a temporary basis to meet the peak demand for transport. This influx of additional vehicles and less familiar drivers placed an enormous strain on the existing infrastructure and personnel. The forecourt, already busy and showing signs of wear, became even more congested. Westland employees tasked with managing the flow of traffic and the unloading process found themselves stretched thinner. The carefully managed, if imperfect, rhythm of the yard was disrupted. The increased tempo meant less time for careful checks, more pressure to speed up turnarounds, and a greater likelihood of communication breakdowns or errors in judgment, pushing the system closer to its breaking point. The milk tanker drivers themselves, whether regular or agency, operated under their own set of pressures. Delivery schedules are often tight in the logistics industry. Delays at one point can have knock-on effects throughout their day. For agency drivers who might be visiting Westland Dairy for the first or second time, navigating an unfamiliar site with faded markings and unclear instructions, while under pressure to unload quickly, created a heightened risk. They relied on clear signage, explicit instructions, and a safe environment, elements that were increasingly compromised at Westland as the volume of milk and consequently traffic continued to surge. Section 7 ignored alarms, the rising tide of near misses. In any industrial setting, near misses are critical learning opportunities. A near miss is an unplanned event that did not result in injury, illness, or damage, but had the potential to do so. At Westland Dairy, as the operational tempo increased and the forecourt conditions deteriorated, the frequency of these near misses began to climb. These incidents might have involved a tanker driver having to brake sharply to avoid a pedestrian who was not clearly visible, or a forklift nearly colliding with another vehicle due to confusing pathways. Perhaps a poorly stacked pallet almost toppled, or a hose connection slipped unexpectedly. There was evidence, both anecdotally from workers and reportedly through some internal channels, that these close calls were becoming more common. Workers on the forecourt, including those from Westland and drivers from Southern Freight, would recount stories of close shaves. Some of these incidents may have been formally reported, logged into a system designed to track such occurrences. Others might have been simply discussed amongst colleagues. A shared moment of relief that a potential accident was averted, but also a growing sense of unease about the inherent risks they faced daily in that environment. These rising concerns and reported near misses did not go unnoticed by everyone. The supervisor, already worried about outdated safety policies and the physical state of the yard, made efforts to bring these issues to the attention of senior management, including the managing director. The message was clear: the combination of increased traffic, poor forecourt conditions, and unclear safety protocols was creating a dangerous situation. The pattern of near misses was a clear warning sign, an alarm bell indicating that the system was under stress and that a more serious incident was becoming increasingly probable if no action was taken. Despite these warnings, the response from the managing director was reportedly one of inaction. The concerns were either downplayed or the MD cited other pressing business priorities, such as meeting the new production targets or managing costs. There seemed to be a reluctance to invest in the necessary upgrades to the forecourt, to revise safety procedures thoroughly, or to provide additional training and resources to cope with the increased operational demands. This failure to heed the warnings, to act upon the clear evidence provided by the escalating number of near misses, was a pivotal moment. It allowed the underlying risks to continue growing, unchecked and unaddressed. Section 8. The tipping point worker C's ordeal on a fateful day. Worker C was a long-standing employee at Westland Dairy. Their role often involved tasks on the forecourt, including guiding vehicles and assisting with the connections for milk unloading. On the day of the accident, Worker C was performing routine duties in this familiar yet increasingly hazardous environment. They were focused on their work, likely accustomed to the constant movement of tankers and other vehicles. The faded markings meant there were no clearly defined safe pedestrian zones in the specific area they were working. Worker C was, in essence, navigating a space where the lines between safety and danger had become blurred. On that same day, an agency tanker driver arrived at Westland Dairy. This driver was not a regular at the site. They were less familiar with its specific layout, its informal operational quirks, and its inherent dangers. The ATD was likely operating under the usual pressures of a tight schedule. They were maneuvering their large articulated vehicle within the congested forecourt, attempting to position it for unloading. The combination of an unfamiliar environment, the pressure to be efficient, and the poor state of the yard markings created a scenario ripe for misunderstanding or misjudgment. The precise sequence of events unfolded with tragic speed. As the ATD was reversing or maneuvering their tanker, their view may have been partially obstructed. Worker C, engaged in their tasks, might have assumed the driver had seen them, or perhaps they were in a spot that, in a well-marked yard, would have been a designated safe zone. Due to the confluence of factors, the faded lines, the potential for blind spots in a large vehicle, the lack of clear communication or established protocols for such maneuvers in that specific congested spot, and perhaps a moment of inattention or incorrect assumption from either party, the tanker struck Worker C. The immediate aftermath was one of shock and urgency. Fellow workers rushed to assist. Emergency services were called. The accident brought the bustling forecourt to a sudden, horrified standstill. Worker C sustained serious injuries, a direct and devastating consequence of the systemic failures that had been allowed to accumulate over time. This was not a random, unpredictable event. It was the culmination of numerous unaddressed issues: the ignored dust complaints, the deteriorating forecourt, the outdated policies, the pressure of increased production, and the failure to act on the warning signs of near misses. The tipping point had been reached, and the cost was painfully human. Section 9. The Unseen Costs Lessons from Westland's Wake-Up Call. The accident involving Worker C and the agency tanker driver sent ripples far beyond the immediate horror of the event. For Worker C, the consequences were life-altering, involving physical pain, lengthy recovery, and an uncertain future regarding their ability to work. The ATD, too, would have faced significant distress and potential professional repercussions. For Westland Dairy, the incident triggered investigations, potential legal action, damage to its reputation, and a stark realization of the financial and human costs associated with a major safety failing. These were the visible, immediate impacts, but the unseen costs were perhaps even greater. This tragic event was not born from a single mistake on a single day. It was the direct result of a cascade of failures, a slow accumulation of risks that had been tolerated or ignored. The dust issue affecting Worker B, though seemingly unrelated to a vehicle accident, spoke to a culture where worker health concerns could be deprioritized. The deteriorating forecourt, with its potholes and faded lines, was a physical manifestation of neglect. The supervisor's unheeded warnings about outdated policies and rising near misses were clear signals of systemic weakness. The pressure to increase deliveries without a corresponding upgrade in safety infrastructure and protocols overloaded a fragile system. The broader implications of the Westland Dairy crisis extend to any workplace in any industry. It underscores the fundamental truth that health and safety are not merely regulatory burdens or expenses to be minimized. They are essential investments in human capital and operational resilience. A proactive safety culture, one that actively seeks out and addresses hazards, listens to worker concerns, and continuously improves, is paramount. This requires leadership commitment, adequate resources, and a genuine belief that every worker deserves to return home safe and healthy at the end of their shift. It is about valuing people above production targets. Ultimately, the accident at Westland Dairy served as a brutal wake-up call. It highlighted how easily small, seemingly manageable issues can compound and interact, creating the conditions for catastrophe. The faded lines on the forecourt were not just faded lines. They were a symptom of a deeper malaise. The unaddressed near misses were not just lucky escapes, they were ignored prophecies. The true cost of inadequate health and safety measures is not just measured in fines or lost production days, but in human suffering and eroded trust. The most vital lesson from Westland is that preventing such incidents requires vigilance, responsibility, and a profound respect for the well-being of every individual in the workplace.